Was this normal? Were other campaigns doing stuff like this?
Put 1,000 elders together and you can raise a hell on earth.
This little-known group of missionaries helped shape institutional success of the church.
And as far as the number of missionaries per capita, there's never been a missionary force like this.
Was this unprecedented, or was this something that fit the times?
Did that make American sensitivities kind of tingle about church and state?
No man can draw the dividing line between the government of God and the government of the children of men. So the church actually creates its own party called the People's Party.
So Theodemocracy, by definition here, it's those at the head receiving revelation and then having that sustained by the people who are governed.
The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has the theological basis for creating the nation the way we need it. Without some kind of moral thing that we all agree on, it's chaos.
Hello, Casey. Welcome back.
We're back. And this is a continuation of our last episode where, boy, there is a lot to sort through about Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. And we referred to two authors there that we drew from, Spencer McBride, who wrote the great book Joseph Smith for President, and also Derek Sainsbury, who wrote Storming the Nation, which is about the presidential campaign, but also about the missionaries that were sent out, the political missionaries called in Nauvoo. So lots to discuss, and we are fortunate to have with us one of the authors of those books. That is Derek Sainsbury, who's the author of Storming the Nation. So, Derek, say hi.
Hello. Grand to be here.
Yeah,
Joseph Smith for president.
Yeah. You'd still vote for him, Derek?
I did in 2016.
Did you?
Oh, my word.
Oh.
Wrote him in.
Oh,
Okay.
my goodness.
Okay.
That's funny.
Fair enough. All right.
Derek, it's so fun to have you with us, man. You are the man of the hour. We have many things to discuss today, so we're excited.
Excited to do it.
Derek R. Sainsbury is an associate professor of church history and doctrine at Brigham Young University. He is the author of Storming the Nation, The Unknown Contributions of Joseph Smith's Political Missionaries. And I think I see a copy of it right behind you there, Derek, kind of over your left shoulder. So there it is. Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. He's also written several academic articles on the political intersections of Latter-day Saint and American histories. For instance, he's currently writing a dual biography of Joseph Smith and Robert F. Kennedy as the only two assassinated presidential candidates in American history, which is that'll be a fascinating book. And also, I just want to say that Derek was the seminary teacher back in the day of my wife, who was then Sarah Swalberg, now Sarah Woodward, and he even claims to remember her, right, Derek?
Oh, I do. I could pick her out of a lineup, but should never be in one.
So you're not just being nice, because when I have a student, well, I have a signal with my wife if a student comes up, so that I go like this, and then my wife goes, "I'm Liz," and then they go, "I'm Stephen," or something like that, and I'm like, "Stephen, you were my favorite," that kind of thing.
Yeah, I have that too, but Sarah's a standout.
Yeah, she's memorable automatically.
Yeah.
Let me mention one other thing that we had permission from Derek to mention too. His book, which is excellent, and you should buy a copy, is also free. You can get a free.
You can buy or you can get it for free. B.
Physical. If you want a physical copy, I strongly suggest you go and get one. I have one on my shelf, but. I noticed when I was researching for our last episode that the RSC, the Religious Studies Center BYU, has made it available for free on their website. And I also downloaded all the chapters and put it on my iPad because I was going on a trip and reread the whole thing. I read it when it first came out, and just want to commend you on your work and want as many people as possible to have a chance to read it, because you really cover some unknown stories from Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. Like, what was your angle and how did you come into this particular wealth of information?
Well, when I came back from my mission, I was studying political science as my undergrad, and I came across some reference of Joseph Smith running for president. And it wasn't a faith crisis, but it was the biggest, I don't agree with that kind of moment. What's going on? How come I've never heard about that? And So basically, when I got my PhD, I decided to make it my dissertation, and specifically to look at who are these people that are going out and both preaching and campaigning. Like, what does that look like? And it took about a decade to track everybody down. So it was a lot of work, and but it's been awesome. I've learned so much, and I was able to connect them. Not only show that the campaign itself was serious, but also how the campaign affected both these individuals and the church as a whole afterward, which I think is a very underappreciated knowledge, right, of these things happening. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where it started off. And then after my dissertation, I turned it into a book a couple years later, and it came out April 6, 2020, just in time for COVID.
Nice.
In time for everybody to stay home and have plenty of time to read.
Sit home and read it.
Yep.
Yeah. And Derek, I'd say that I'd say your book is less about presidential politics and more about like how this little known group of missionaries helped shape like the survival, the migration, and the eventual like institutional success of the church in the decades following Joseph Smith's death, right? Like it's really following that group. And you argue that Joseph Smith's presidential campaign has been underestimated by both secular historians and many Latter-day Saint historians, as you just mentioned. So here's a question for you. What evidence most convinced you that the campaign, Joseph Smith's campaign, was a serious political effort rather than just primarily like a missionary effort or a symbolic endeavor?
Yeah. How long do you have?
Well,
Riff, brother, riff.
start going.
Well, let's start with the other argument and steelman it. It comes from the idea that campaign is symbolic, and the idea that it was just one of many different options that they're looking at in the spring of 1844. Originates with B.H. Roberts. When volume 6 of the History of the Church comes out in 1912, he writes an editorial comment where he says this: of course, there could be no hope seriously entertained that he would be elected, but as explained by an editorial in the Times and Seasons, and I'll give you the quote from that, if the saints could not succeed in electing their candidate, they would have the satisfaction of knowing that they had acted conscientiously. They had used their best judgment under the circumstances, and if they had to throw away their votes, it was better to do so upon someone worthy than upon someone unworthy. The prophet himself evidently regarded his nomination humorously rather than seriously, except that it might result in withdrawing the saints from the battle between the two political parties. I care but little about the presidential chair, he said on one occasion. I would not give us half as much for the office of the President of the United States as I would for the one which I now hold as Lieutenant Governor of the Nauvoo Legion. When I get a hold of the Eastern papers and see how popular I am afraid myself that I should be elected. But if I should be, I would not say to the Latter-day Saints, your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you. Ooh. And then the other evidence, and he did not have a legitimate path to presidency. That's absolutely true. The other idea is that it was just one of many things that they're playing with. So the Council of 50, which was created in March, 2 months after Joseph Smith had been nominated for president of the United States, they're looking for a way to protect the church, protect the Zion effort. And they're looking at options of going to Texas, which was an independent republic at the time. They even sent an ambassador down there to talk with Sam Houston. They talk about and are making plans to move out into Mexico, the Rocky Mountain area, maybe, or even Oregon. They're also submitting 2 proposals to the Congress of the United States. One, that Joseph Smith be allowed to create an army to protect the overland trail to Oregon and to be able to protect the trail to Texas. And then the other is that the federal government actually adopt the city of Nauvoo as a federal territory so that it would be under the federal jurisdiction, which means at the time that the Bill of Rights would actually apply to them, right? And all those things are true too as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why do I argue that it was serious? And I believe he might use different evidence, but I've talked with Spencer before on this. If he were here, he talks about it being a serious campaign.
McBride.
Yeah, Spencer McBride. Sorry.
Yeah, great.
And this was the quote from that he was using, not Spencer, but B.H. Roberts was using to say that they weren't serious. Under existing circumstances, we have no other alternative. And if we can accomplish our objective, well, that is well. If not, we shall have the satisfaction of knowing that we acted conscientiously and have used our best judgments. And if we have to throw away our votes, we'd rather do so upon the worthy. Mm-hmm. So there's more to that, though. There's more to that ad than just that, the context, which I'll come back to in just a second. You asked the question, so that's the argument, right? My argument, I have literally 30 pages of evidence here, which we won't go through. So on January 29th, when Joseph Smith announces or his leadership council decides to run him for president, they say that they will have independent electors, him as a candidate, which means the electoral college, right? You don't really actually vote for a president. You vote for a slate of electors who then cast their votes in December for a president of the United States. So the very fact that the first thing they say is that we're going to create independent electors in all the different states say that, you know, if they win a state, they can go to the electoral college with those votes. If it's just a symbolic thing, there's no need to even consider that. Just send missionaries out, right? The next thing is Joseph says this, and notice what he says because it sets up the whole campaign. If you attempt to accomplish this, you must send every man in the city who is able to speak in public throughout the land to electioneer and make stump speeches, advocate the Mormon religion, purity of elections, and call upon the people to stand by the law and put down mobocracy. And then he names a few individuals. They should go to Pennsylvania. They should go to Vermont. He should go to New York. And then he says this, tell the people we have had Whig and Democratic presidents long enough. We want a president of the United States. If I ever get into the presidential chair, I will protect the people in their rights and liberties. And then he says this, there is oratory enough in the church to carry me into the presidential chair, the first slide. So this is all being done in a private meeting. This isn't public consumption, you know, rah-rah campaign. Mm-hmm. To me, that's the very first huge evidence. And it gets bigger when you look at the fact of the missionaries. So the missionaries are actually called during General Conference, the same General Conference as the King Follett Discourse. There's a special session on Monday, and all the elders in and around Nauvoo are asked to be there. So there's about 1,000 of them that are at this meeting. And in this meeting, which Joseph Smith doesn't attend, because in those days, as you ran for president, you didn't campaign for yourself. That was seen as being too ambitious. You sent other people to do that. And so Brigham Young, as the head of the Quorum of the 12, and Hiram Smith, as assistant president of the church, they speak to these men. And here's a couple things they say. We are acquainted, this is Brigham, we are acquainted with the views of General Smith, the Democrats and Whigs and all factions. It is now time to have a president of the United States. Elders will be sent to preach the gospel and electioneer. The government belongs to God. No man can draw the dividing line between the government of God and the government of the children of men. He then finished his talk by saying, this is a fire that cannot be put out. We will turn the world upside down. Hiram follows up and he says, we calculate to send about 1,000 of you, which is basically all of them that were there. Yeah. He said, we calculate to spend about 1,000 of you, put 1,000 elders together, and you can raise a hell on earth. You will have a great deal of knowledge, and we want you to be successful. Do not fear men or the devil. Electioneer with all the people, male and female, and exhort them to do the thing that is right, which means vote for his brother, right? We want a president of the United States, not a party president, but a president of the whole people, a president who will maintain every man in his rights. I wish all of you to do all the good you can. We will try and convert the nations into one solid union. I despise the principle that divides the nation into party and faction. Lift up your voices like thunder. There is power and influence among us to put in a president. And then Hiram finishes up, I don't wonder at the old Carthaginian lawyer being afraid of Joseph Smith being elected. So then Brigham gets back up and says, all in favor of doing this. It's that the records say everybody says yes, except for one vote, but doesn't say who that person is. And after that vote, this is from the records. I'm quoting from the records. The dearest and biggest vote and the most unanimous vote that ever passed in the world went for Joseph to be president. It echoed along the hill. So,
so that makes it sound like they thought he maybe could win and that their efforts would be worthwhile.
Absolutely. And this is in public.
Okay.
I'll give you a few evidences in a minute in private.
Because that was the big question I was having is, obviously, if you're going to take the time and resources to run for president, in public, you're going to say that you think you got a chance to win. But you're saying in private, they were saying the same thing, too, that they were really serious about this. Although it does seem like they may have recognized there might have needed to be some divine intervention.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
For him to win.
In fact, let me just give you a couple of the quotes that you're talking about. So in the Council of 50, right, they're talking together. They believe they're the nucleus of the kingdom of God that will rule during the millennium. And their current objective is how do we protect the church, right? And they have the options that we talked about, including Joseph Smith running for president. So in a meeting on April 11th, he says, our elders are considered the most ignorant men in the world, but when they open their mouths, they shall silence the multitudes. They will revolutionize the world by intelligence. We, meaning the Council of 50, consider ourselves the head and Washington the tail. And in another time in the Council of 50, he says the following, that this council should go forth immediately to electioneer. Let us have delegates in all the electoral districts and hold a national convention at Baltimore. The easiest and best way to accomplish the objective in view, meaning, again, they're balancing all these, did the memorials to Congress work? Did we go to Texas? They're balancing all these things. And Joseph Smith, this is April 25th, says that the easiest and best way to accomplish the object in view is to make an effort to secure the election at this contest. Let us have delegates in all the electoral districts and hold a national convention. Let every man, meaning the electioneers, assume an authoritative station as though he were somebody, right? So this idea that you're important. They vote to establish political newspapers in every major city in the United States. They only end up doing that in New York because the campaign ends so early. On the 3rd of May, that the Council of 50 should now disperse again. They haven't left yet. And to all the states and preach an electioneer for him to be president. And when he is president, we can send out ministers. So there's him saying, and when he is president. So there's this idea of that. And then he says, and I think this is what you're talking about, Casey, here. In a meeting a few days later, he says, he prophesies in the name of the Lord that the elders should have more power and more might and more means than they ever had before, 100-fold. Let them get up meetings and carry out the election. So there's a lot of confidence in the Council of 50. And again, this isn't public consumption. This isn't the rah-rah that all political campaigns are doing. This is their private discussions about what's going on. And there are other quotes where they're talking about the Lord going with the missionaries. So, yeah, I don't think they believed that just running a normal campaign is going to create an election for Joseph Smith. But they seem to believe that some kind of divine intervention would go with them, right? And so I think that's what they're talking about when they're talking about confidence in winning. And Joseph shares this confidence, not just, there's two men that show up before the Illinois State Convention. They're pretty famous. They're cousins. One is Charles Francis Adams. He's the President John Adams' son. He's going to become a heavyweight and be the vice presidential candidate in the 1848 election with Martin Van Buren, by the way, on the Free Soil Party. And the other is his cousin Josiah Quincy, who the following year will be voted mayor of Boston. And they've come out to check out the frontier and check out these Latter-day Saints and what's going on out here with this Joseph Smith. And they meet with him. They go around the city. They talk. They're both Whigs at the time, so they're talking to him about the political party. Joseph says, basically, Henry Clay, nope, I don't like him. And then he says this, one of them records this, that Joseph told them, quote, he might one day so hold the balance between parties as to render his election to that office by no means unlikely. And even with people, just normal people, like regular everyday people, he talked this way. So we have the journal or diary of a young man who was staying at not a Latter-day Saint, who was staying at the Mansion House when it was a hotel. And he remembers sitting at the same table with Joseph, and that Joseph would often talk to him about his candidacy for the presidency and his belief that he would be elected. When this young man would say, I don't think anybody that's not a Latter-day Saint will vote for you, right? I don't think that's going to happen. And Joseph would simply reply, the Lord will turn the hearts of the people. So, both in public and private, there's a lot of confidence. This is a serious campaign, but with the caveat you mentioned, Casey, that they believe that it will work because of, some kind of divine intervention. Mm-hmm. And I guess the last thing I would add to that is the number of missionaries, right? So 200, that day that we talked about on April 9th, 277 sign up. You can actually see the document on the Joseph Smith paper site where they're scribbling in their name, what state they want to go to, all that kind of stuff. When they print the list the next week in the Nauvoo Neighbor, it's up to 330. So more people have come on. Now, I started with that 330, and by the time I printed my book, I pretty much doubled it to 621. And I found these missionaries by looking in other missionaries' journals, by looking in newspapers, not just the Nauvoo newspapers, but newspapers all around the country, looking at letters of any missionaries during 1844, family histories. I'm sure there are more out there. In fact, since the book, I've found 30 more. So we're up to 670 missionaries. There's not a missionary force in that number until 1905. So that's 60 years away. And as far as the number of missionaries per capita, there's never been a missionary force like this. So if this is not serious, I don't know what is. I mean, they're serious. Whether their chances of being elected were serious is a different matter. But they took it seriously, as Joseph did, everything, and put everything they could into it.
Now, the question that comes to mind as you're bringing all that up is, were what the missionaries doing, was this normal? Were other campaigns sending out electioneering message? I know they wouldn't be called missionaries, but sending 600 missionaries out and having them do political speeches while they're preaching the gospel. Were other campaigns doing stuff like this at the time? Or was it more of because James K. Polk ends up winning the election, right?
Right.
And my understanding is he just kind of stays at home and writes letters to people. Was this unprecedented, or was this something that fit the times?
It's starting to fit the times. So it's true. Like they would sit at home and write letters to newspapers and respond. And that's since newspapers was everybody's, medium, and newspapers would copy other newspapers. And that's how word got around the country. That's generally how they did it. Mm-hmm. In the late 1830s or mid 1830s, the Whig Party is created to counter Andrew Jackson and Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, the Democratic Party. And they bring a new type of campaigning in 1840, so the election before this, where they have big barbecues, they roll out big parties of whiskey, they have parades, they create campaign buttons, and they send out these electioneers. Some of them start to send electioneers to go campaign on their behalf, more so than just like one or two lectures or newspapers. But it's not a lot, right? And it's generally local people. So if you're in Illinois, the Whig Illinois Democratic Party, someone like Abraham Lincoln, by the way, in 1840 is out campaigning for William Harrison, who wins the election, the Whig who wins the election. And so what Joseph Smith does is he turns the volume up on that, right? And sends out these political missionaries that both the Whigs and the Democrats are going to do that in that same election, but not to the kind of extent that Joseph Smith is doing. So it fits the time, but it's also pushing ahead the envelope of how party politics are happening. And this is, it's a very partisan time. Most people don't know the 1840s. Like I remember reading letters of, a Democrat saying he's never going to let his daughter marry a Whig, or vice versa. There was a survey done for the 1844 election, a study done, and they found that for every one person, of course, only men can vote. So for every one man that was on the rolls of any church in the United States, there were 10 men on the rolls of the two political parties. So politics was defining people, whether they were Whig or Democrat. It was contentious. These new methods were bringing politics both to the commoner and into people's faces a lot more. And so that's the environment that he's coming into. And he's trying to use the same things and just accelerate them, have newspapers everywhere like the Democrats and the Whigs did, but especially with these political missionaries. In fact, I found one reference in a newspaper where a Whig newspaper talking about their people in Ohio that were doing this, and they actually called them political missionaries. I thought that was interesting.
Interesting. Now, although Joseph never comes close to winning the presidency, we talked about his martyrdom and how that put a quick end to all that. But you say that his campaign created a nationwide, you call him a cadre of loyal, experienced leaders whose efforts were instrumental in preserving and building the church after 1844. Tell us how your research developed your understanding of the relationship between these missionaries on the one hand, and then the later leadership and settlement and political culture of the church in the Great Basin.
Sure, absolutely. I'd love to answer that question. Let me start with talking about some of the experiences these missionaries have as they go out. And again, like I said, ends up being at least 670 now that we know of. The biggest chunk are coming from Nauvoo, but there are also more than 100 that are in local conferences that they call, because the plan is to have a conference, and two men are made presidents of the campaign for each city or for each state. They're going to hold the conferences around the state, and in those conferences, many men are called to join the campaign, and many start right away, including a young 17-year-old named Chauncey West. He joins the campaign on July 6th. Now you're going, wait, what? They don't know Joseph's dead yet, but this is something that's going on. And they have all kinds of interesting stories, and everything from hilarious wedding reception crashing, to men struck with lightning, to serious rallies that are getting national attention, and even violence. So they would go out and they would campaign. They literally, when they would hold these conferences, the Saturday would be campaigning and the Sunday would be preaching. If they were in somebody's home, they would often, one would teach about Joseph Smith, and then the other would pull out the Views pamphlet, which was his pamphlet describing his policies, what he wanted to do, and say, hey, he's running for president, and here's this, that, and the other. So it's kind of a very interesting mission. And for 2/3 of these men, this is their first mission. Mm-hmm. For most of them, this is their first mission to both campaign and preach.
So on the one hand, here's the Book of Mormon that he translated by the gift and power of God. On the other hand, here's his political views of government, and we invite you to read both.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Do you believe the country is falling out of control? I do too. I have the solution for it right here, right? And you can see a little bit of that in what I mentioned with Hiram's talk when they were first recruited, that they want to convert the nations, that they're not separating the idea of campaigning and bringing the gospel to people. Let me give you just like a couple of tidbits of fun.
By the way, can I ask you just a quick question?
Oh, please, yeah.
Did that make people nervous? Did that make the American sensitivities kind of tingle about church and state, to say he's a prophet and he's running for president? Like, how'd that play out on the ground level?
That's a great question. And there's a common theme. And maybe I'll find our good friend Lorenzo Snow. By the way, he's the campaign president for Ohio, one of the two. And take a guess where they hold their conference, their campaign conference.
Kirtland
Temple. So if you sat in the Kirtland Temple, you've also sat where there was over 60 of them, missionaries sat, listened to political speeches from different leaders of the church, and then get assigned to campaign in different congressional districts. Okay. Now, Lorenzo Snow says this, that to answer your question. As he looks back, he says this, and then I'll give you a couple of other examples. Many people, both saints and Gentiles, thought the campaign a bold stroke of policy. Our own people, for the most part, were quite willing to use their influence and devote their time and energies to the promotion of the objective in view. However, to many persons who knew nothing of Joseph, but through the ludicrous reports in circulation, the movement seemed a species of insanity, while others, with no less astonishment, hailed it as a beacon of prosperity. In Indiana, two missionaries are talking with an old man. He's a veteran of the Revolutionary War. They're preaching to him about, or campaigning to him about Joseph Smith's views. And he says, well, that sounds like General Washington. I served under him. And those are great ideas. But the most common response, if people liked the ideas, was, for example, in New Hampshire, in Petersboro, New Hampshire, Erastus Snow, who's the campaign president there, he holds a meeting, and it's mostly attended by non-Latter-day Saints. And over 3 days, they come up with, kind of a compromise joint resolution about the need to vote for independent candidates. And here's one, if you feel so inclined, right? Joseph Smith. But the concept was, a lot of people liked his ideas and liked the idea of a third way out of this partisan mess that has suddenly blown up in the past decade. But most didn't like Joseph Smith. So it was like, we like the ideas, but not the man so much, is what you most commonly would hear as far as what I read in the sources.
Okay.
So here's a couple of just quick stories. Well, one thing to mention is they baptize a lot of people. Hundreds of people are baptized in this mission. A lot of friends and family, because that's where they're told to go to, right? And start with friends and family in their home states, and then build from there. We have one time where Mesa Lyman crosses. He's in Cincinnati. He crosses the river over into Kentucky, and he says he campaigns, and nobody would listen to him but 2 women and 3 pigs. So you had stuff like that going on. But then you also had, say, July 1st in Boston, where 6 of the Quorum of the 12 were there for a big rally that was attended by the city's newspapers and over 2,000 people. And there are not that many people that are Latter-day Saints in Boston. And it's an all-day convention. It's in one of the biggest halls there that they rent. And I mean, the newspapers talk about it. Some think the ideas are great. Some think the ideas are bad. It actually ends in a little bit of a riot, because there are some Whig gentlemen there, some young Whigs, who purposely start a fight in the balcony that quickly gets out of control, and everybody's running for cover. And that's reported all along the Eastern Seaboard. So you have big things going on like that, and also campaigning to pigs, right? For some, it was not dangerous at all, other than maybe having to sleep outside a lot of nights or whatever. For the few that were sent to the South, especially the Upper South, this was a difficult mission, because Joseph Smith is calling for the abolition of slavery. And so it gets a little more dangerous down in the South, where some of them are beaten. There's a great story where in Tennessee they're having a meeting, and the mob led by the sheriff comes in and surrounds them inside, all with hickory sticks. And Abraham O. Smoot, who's the president for Tennessee, starts to give his speech, and the gentleman starts to reach for him to stop him from speaking. And there was a local woman. She's described as being 6 foot. Her name is Mrs. Camp. She's 6 foot. I don't know why this information is in the journal, but she's 6 foot, 200 pounds. And she turns to the sheriff and she says, if you touch those men, I will see your heart blood.
Okay.
Wow.
Whoa, that's an awesome threat.
And it stops him, right?
I'm going to use that on someone.
You should. And by the way, what's her husband doing out in the yard? He's got his shotgun and he's kicking some guy, poor guy on the ground who's talking bad about Joseph Smith. So, I mean, the local, it's a difficult thing in the South, but for the most part, wherever the electioneers went, the local people helped out in one way or another. Mm. And so, there's momentum building in small places like the New Hampshire that we talked about, and in New York and in Boston. But again, it's for the ideas, not for the candidate, right? Almost never for the candidate. And so what happens, obviously, is that, as we all know, Joseph Smith becomes the first assassinated presidential candidate. And that's why the 12 are away from Nauvoo. They're on these missions. And that's why hundreds of men are not in Nauvoo as well. They're on these missions. And they all learn slowly as the news travels across the nation. For some, it takes 3 weeks to find out, those that are up in New England, what's happened. And they're just struck. They didn't expect this. It's a shock to the system. Yeah. Including obviously Brigham Young and the apostles that are out there in the Boston area at the time. And the call comes to everybody go back to Nauvoo. Brigham Young sends out a letter and to the usual places where the saints gather in the different states. And so they come back to Nauvoo with shared trauma, right? Shared trauma of this experience, and that they're out campaigning for that at the same time. They've been working with the Quorum of the 12 all along, from the callings on April 9th through the end. So when they get back to Nauvoo, you can see that this would be a group of men who might be more inclined to follow the 12 and who might be more inclined to believe in the ideas of Theodemocracy and Aristarchy that Joseph Smith had talked about privately and publicly and had implemented, to the point where, as I looked at what happened to them after they were, after Joseph Smith's assassination, right? I used a model to figure out just how much of the general population, general male population, adult male population of the church were they? And they're about 15%. Okay. But they're not represented as 15% in everything that happens after that, right? So the next 5 apostles, all electioneers. When you get out to Utah, the first state president, electioneer. His counselors, electioneers. The high council, most of them electioneers. They're also the mayor, because of how the democracy works, and the city council. And so you're seeing this system that I noticed and that I wrote about, where what's happening is there's no smoking gun kind of idea where any of them are told, because you electioneer for Joseph Smith, we are making you this. But something has to account for sometimes they're 12 times more likely to be a bishop or a state president. So something has to account for that. And I did I used that stupid statistics class they made me take to do analysis and regression and all that other stuff. And there's nothing, there's not family, connections. There's not, how early in the church you were, how many missions you'd served before. Like, the only thing that made any kind of a blip is this fact that they were campaign missionaries. And so it's not quite the same as, say, Zion's Camp, but it's analogous. How do you say
analogous?
It's not quite the same as Zion's Camp, but it's analogous to it. Okay. And so I follow them all the way through, through their deaths. And I mean, even into the 1860s, though they're only 2% at that point of the male population, they way outswing their weight as far as who's bishop, who's stake president, who's in the legislature, who's the probate judge, so forth and so on.
So how do you account for that then? Like, what was it about them electioneering for the prophet that is going to translate into this disproportionate representation in church leadership later? Like, what do you think? Like,
That's a great question that I thought a lot about. And with the analogy of Zion's camp, there is something to that. So if you think about it, the Lord wanted 500 men, right? But don't leave if you have less than 100 men. Well, they just barely had 200 when it was all said and done. Right. So why might some have volunteered and others didn't? Obviously, some were exercising faith. I mean, this is a difficult mission if you think about Zion's camp, because this may turn into armed conflict. One of the sections that around that talks about being willing to, sacrifice your life. And so, first of all, going on that Zion's camp kind of pre-selects people who are really, really dedicated, right? Right. And then many of them talk about how that experience glued them to the prophet Joseph. They got to see him up close, see him in day-to-day stuff. And that it also trained them and prepared them for leadership, how to organize, how to problem solve. And then, of course, the faithfulness of then, we're just going to turn around and go back home, right? Without accomplishing what they're going to do. And if you take that and you then take it to the Joseph Smith presidential campaign, you have a very similar thing. They're being asked to go out and do an extremely difficult mission. Not just preach the most unpopular probably religion in the United States at the time, but also say, hey, our prophet is running for president. You should vote for him too. And so again, there's going to be some pre-selection there of those who actually volunteer to sign up and go as having more faith in the idea, right, of this mission, both to campaign and to and preach. And then, of course, again, they're getting to see each other up close, working together. They split companionships up all the time. They're seeing the quorum of the 12 up close, out in the world, not in Nauvoo. And so I think there's a similar bonding to the 12 that you see there and to the 12 to them. And then, of course, the difficult experience of learning that Joseph's dead and that everything they'd hoped for didn't turn out, just kind of like Zion's camp, but even stronger, right, in the sense that now the prophet of the church is dead. And so I think, with Joseph, we have this later account where he talks about the fact that the Lord specifically chose most of the 12 and the 70 because of their sacrifice, right? And, there's no smoking gun that says the same thing about this group. But to me, it seems like the only explanation, like I said, I did regression
the pattern holds
on everything else. And it seems to be, hey, look, I worked with Chauncey C. West in New York. He did awesome as a teenager. Like, who knows? Yeah. But again, the numbers don't lie. They're so incredibly lopsided that there seems to be an effect. And of course, what they do out in Utah is become a theodemocracy, right? So
and I gotta pause you there for a second. We tried to define the terms theodemocracy and aristarchy, and when we went through this, we're using your book,
right?
But I want to hear directly from you. And let me frame this one way too. You mentioned at the episode that when you first heard about Joseph Smith's presidential campaign, you felt a little strange about it, uncomfortable.
A little more than strange and uncomfortable.
And honestly, even understanding the terms theodemocracy and aristarchy, I still am a little uncomfortable with that. Maybe it's my, upbringing of church and state being separated, but
sure.
Define those terms for us, how they would have understood it, and how you kind of reconciled those as being okay, not dangerous. This isn't a religion trying to take over the United States. Tell us a little bit about your journey there.
Excellent question. Thank you. Joseph Smith is the one that uses the word theodemocracy. So the idea of theodemocracy in 1844, Joseph announces it in the newspaper, in the Times and Seasons, and this is how he defines it. As the world is governed too much, and there is not a nation now occupying the earth which acknowledges Almighty God as their lawgiver, I go emphatically, virtuously, and humanely for a theodemocracy where God and the people hold the power to conduct the affairs of men in righteousness, and where liberty, free trade and sailors' rights, and the protection of all life and property shall be maintained inviolate for the benefit of, in all capitals, all. So the main reason he's running, right, is because they have not been protected in their rights. And this idea of theodemocracy and aristarchy, and I'll define that as well. You see its earliest iteration, I think, in section 98 of the Doctrine and Covenants, where the Lord, after the saints are expelled from from Jackson County, in section 98, the Lord tells them to use the government, right?
Yeah.
To get their lands back. And he says this, I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law, that constitutional law of the land. As pertaining to the law of man, whatsoever is more or less than this cometh of evil. I, the Lord God, make you free, therefore you are free indeed, and the law maketh you free. Now he says this, nevertheless, when the wicked rule, the people mourn, right, quoting the Bible. Wherefore, honest men and wise men should be sought for diligently, and good men and wise men you should observe to uphold. Otherwise, whatever is less than this cometh of evil. So this is the idea of good people should be in government. Wise people should be in government. Honest people should be in government. And this is not a new idea. The word aristarchy means government by good or excellent men. Different from aristocracy, which is the idea, you're born into a certain family, you have the right to rule. It's more Thomas Jefferson's idea of a natural aristocracy, people of merit, people that are wise and good. He and the founders saw the Constitution, the nation, and then later the Constitution of the nation, as working with this idea of, it was called at the time republicanism, which is this idea that, you vote for the best and brightest among us who are disinterested in the passions of the day, have no, they're well enough off that they don't need to be corrupt and use government to get money. Their love is for the people and for the republic, and they're wise, the wisest among us. And so there's that idea is kind of going on in the United States until Andrew Jackson, right? And popular government and mass elections and so forth and so on. The idea is who are these good Republican principles, people among us who can make this republic work. In 1838, before the Mormon War happens, Joseph Smith is walking around with his brother Samuel, and they're talking about everything that's happened, and he comes back and he dictates what's known as this is March of 1838, the motto of the Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints. And this is what he wrote. The Constitution of our country, formed by the fathers of liberty, peace and good order in society, love to God and goodwill to man, all good and wholesome laws, and virtue and truth above all things, and aristarchy live forever. But woe to tyrants, mob, aristocracy, anarchy, and Toryism, and all those who invent or seek out unrighteous lawsuits under the pretext of the color of law, either religious or political. Exalt the standard of democracy, down with priestcraft, and let the people say amen, that the blood of our fathers may not cry from the ground. Speaking of the Revolutionary War. So you can see him as early as 1838 using the word aristarchy. Mm-hmm. When they go to Van Buren, right, after getting kicked out of Missouri, and Van Buren says, I can do nothing for you, or I will do nothing for you, whichever way you want to take it. That's when he works hard to get an independent city charter, right, that will protect the Latter-day Saints. And the idea, that I'm sure you've talked about that in other episodes. The idea behind the charter, right, is to have enough power to protect themselves, including the Nauvoo Legion, including combining of certain powers that are in other city charters. When they go to vote, the brethren give out the candidates, and everybody votes for the candidates. There's no dissenting votes. So you can see that's a theodemocracy, this idea where the president of the church nominates, or leaders of the church nominate, and people then go vote for it. Joseph Smith introduces this idea into Relief Society in 1842. He doesn't call it theodemocracy. He calls it a living constitution, right? You remember that it starts, the Relief Society starts where these women want to put together a sewing society. They create a constitution. They take it to Joseph. And Joseph says, wow, this is the best constitution I think I've ever seen, but I've got something more for you. And he creates the Relief Society. And of course, Emma, as the elect lady, is to rule. And then she calls 2 counselors. And Joseph Smith says, here's your constitution. It's a living constitution. It's these 3 women as they receive revelation for this society, as the presidency of the church receives revelation for the entire church. And so you see that throughout Nauvoo, this idea of we're creating a democracy, but the idea is that it's governed by God. So it's a really tricky idea to try to unravel. And if you look from the outside, it doesn't look like theodemocracy. It looks like theocracy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so there's that obvious tension. From the saints' point of view, they're just trying to use democratic powers to defend themselves because nobody else is. The president's not doing it. The states aren't doing it. The cities aren't doing it. Average citizens. So you have 2 very different perspectives of what Nauvoo is. That's ultimately going to lead to Joseph Smith's assassination. So that's the idea of theodemocracy.
Do you think the church has completely abandoned the ideals that animated theodemocracy, or have some elements survived in different forms? Like you mentioned the Relief Society. I was just thinking that we sustain leaders today. We usually call it common consent, but
Right.
Is that an example of theodemocracy in action where they've been chosen by the church leaders and then there's a vote called by the saints to sustain it? Or am I reading that wrong? Like how are there any vestiges of this still today, or is it all gone?
Well, I think the law of common consent, which predates theodemocracy, right? It's from the very beginning of the church, is Joseph's taking that idea under inspiration, as he feels, to create the Relief Society, to decide how to vote, to decide, how to manage the affairs of the church in the political sphere, because neither of the political parties are helping them. As far as today, so you see that, that law of consent, common consent predates it, but you still see that today, right? That's what we do, but not in a governmental form. In 1896, the church, the first presidency, introduced or published on April 6th, by the way, what came to be known as the Political Manifesto, which was that if any general authority is going to run, they have to pass it by the first presidency, because 2 of them hadn't done that. And then also that the church was not going to have a political party as it had in Utah, and that the people to just join the 2 national parties, which are the Democrats and Republicans at the time. So if you're an outsider living in Utah, you might say that theodemocracy still lives, because we're about 50% of the population, a little over 50% of the population, but closer to 80% of the representatives in the Utah State House and Senate. And the church occasionally gets involved in political matters, not candidates. And so, a common complaint you might hear in Utah from non-Latter-day Saints, especially if they had a bad experience with Latter-day Saints, is that we're living in a theodemocracy. But as far as the way the church handles politics, both domestically and internationally, I just don't see much of that left. Aristarchy, the idea of calling good, excellent men, the idea of counseling together to decide who those men are, I think that's been there from the foundation of the church. I think, I believe in the prophecies of the return of Jesus Christ. I believe that there will be a government on the earth, as Joseph taught, as Brigham taught, as John taught, as Wilford taught, as Lorenzo taught, that will consist of Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saints who will be the kingdom of God, like the Council of 50 considered themselves to be. So I believe that idea of theodemocracy will return, but only in the light of the second coming and the governing of the millennium. So I don't see it continuing today.
Okay, interesting. You used the the Relief Society establishment as an example of theodemocracy. So I wondered if there was some carryover today in the sustaining of officers, but you would say not so much.
No, we have a church handbook of instructions. That is the church's constitution when it comes to policy, at least, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yep.
And we do believe in revelation to be able to not pick and choose, but to have revelation on how to apply those policies directly. Whereas the idea of a living constitution is the idea there is nothing written except for the...
No handbook.
Yeah, there's no handbook. It's the decisions you make by revelation. Of course, you can write them down and go back to them, but by revelation, you can also change them. In fact, one of the first things that the Council of 50 does, and here's Joseph really using Aristarchic theodemocracy, right? He decides to call what he sees as the 50 wisest and best men, including 3 non-members, kind of as a token representation that when this government actually becomes the government of the earth, it won't just have Latter-day Saints. And they have to all agree that they're to counsel together. And one of the things they're asked to do is write a constitution. There's a committee formed for the kingdom of God, and they're struggling with it. And Joseph says, I've got a revelation for you. And then gives the revelation, which is, you are my constitution, this group, by revelation.
I see.
And so, again, I don't see it surviving in the same manner as we have today.
So theodemocracy, by definition here, is there's not a written constitution per se. It's those at the head receiving revelation and then having that sustained by the people who are governed. That's essentially the mechanism of theodemocracy.
Yes. And so you see that then out in Utah, right? Like if you're called as the bishop of Provo, then you're on the ballot as mayor of Provo. And since there's nobody but Latter-day Saints, you win the election. It's only in the late 1860s after the railroad that there gets to be a substantial population here. And interestingly enough, they non-Latter-day Saint, they create their own political party. They go to a unified party. Both Democrats and Republicans, they create what they call the Liberal Party. And so they start putting people on the ballot. So the church actually creates its own party called the People's Party. And so then you actually have somewhat competitive elections. Not really, but at least there's another group going until the federal government basically takes away the rights of the Latter-day Saints and they can't vote. And so that you start to see Salt Lake and Ogden and other places get filled with the other groups.
Interesting. Okay.
See, and for me,
didn't mean to get too far ahead.
No, you're fine.
No, the most interesting part of the Council of 50 Minutes is it seems like it's sort of like a microcosm of what we think that millennial government might be like. Like, I'm okay with the idea of theodemocracy if Jesus Christ is the head of the government because of who he is and what he represents. But the Council of 50 is interesting because I also can see why people would be unnerved by a religious figure like Joseph Smith running for president, because then the question becomes, does this turn into a regime that only favors one religion?
Right.
Because it's led by the leader of that religion. And it seems like explicitly what Joseph Smith was going for from the Council of 50 Minutes was a pluralistic society, that he's saying, I'm going to defend the rights of all religions. You're not necessarily going to have to be a Latter-day Saint. But we're going to submit to God first and foremost,
right?
Even though that might look a little bit different for different religions.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. Some of the men in the council are a little more zealous than others. They're like, "We'll just move the capital. Once you win, we'll move the capital to Nauvoo. We don't want to go to Washington. It's a stinky place. We don't want to go there." I mean, Sidney Rigdon in that time period. You didn't run for more than one. If you ran for president more than once, you were Andrew Jackson. You were Martin Van Buren. Okay. And so like Polk, Clay, who's the Whig candidate in 44, Polk in 44, they both say one term only. Right. And so in the minutes, when they finally decide on Sidney Rigdon as vice presidential candidate, and that's the reason he has to leave to Pennsylvania, because the Constitution requires the vice president to be from a different state than the president. He says, okay, well, this is great and all. What about the next election, right? I'd like to be considered as the president for the next election. And so, they have a vote to do that. So there's some that are pulling more zealously towards this. Joseph's trying to stay more, as you mentioned, pluralistic, but he considers this to be the kingdom of God, right? The government that will eventually govern the earth and turn swords into plowshares. What is the word? Swords into plowshares. Sorry. And so that idea, if you read the minutes, it can be a little uncomfortable, especially some of the more zealous things that are put out there. But again, one of the reasons why I think this election is so serious is they have all these options that they're going with, and Joseph basically shuts them all down and says, it's the election. This is the way we can do it. And then if obviously they're thinking if they can't get elected, then they'll move out, right, and form their own government. Give America a chance, if you will, before we leave her. And so, reading the Council of 50 Minutes can be a little unsettling. You can see why people would be upset if they found out what was going on. They're trying to be confidential, not what was going on, but how it could be twisted, right? How it could so easily be twisted, which of course is what happens. Somebody leaks what's going on to the Nauvoo Expositor, and several of the comments in there could only come from somebody who knows specific words and ideas that were being shared in the Council of 50 that are then twisted, right? To claim that Joseph Smith is taking over the national government. He's going to make the apostles the governors of the different states, right? There's no mechanism for that in the Constitution. There's no hope of Joseph even being elected. But you can see how different, one of the things that you guys do really well, I do follow your podcast, and I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing for the entire church in helping them understand history better. Early on, you did a series on, different historical skills that you can do, right, to be able to understand history better. And, post, especially 1896, and especially, in the 1950s, we go from being non-American, basically, to uber-Americans, right? We've got an apostle in the cabinet who's saying the prayers for all the cabinet meetings. We're like, woo, super American. By the 1950s, with church separation of church and state is so there. That's what the three of us were born into, that idea, right, of a very patriotic church who sees the government as protection for the saints. We're dealing with a time where the government was actually the persecutor of the saints, which will continue again for decades. So they're living in a completely different world than ours, which I think if we agree with that, if we can realize what the facts on the ground, then the culture, the ideas, we can see why they're going where they're going with what they're going, and not be so alarmed, maybe, if you will. I came to understand that over time. They're doing, just like everything else, Joseph is doing the best he can with what God has revealed to him. There's not a handbook other than the Doctrine and Covenants revelations. And, they're working together, counseling together. Some of the best information we have on how to counsel comes out of that Council of 50.
Can I ask a question out of left field a little bit?
Please.
Do you see any parallels between like that 19th century context with Latter-day Saints concerns about political polarization happening then and current American politics?
If you were to go read the newspapers in the 1840s, the answer to that would be yes. I'm going to give you a quote. You tell me which election it comes from. Okay, you ready?
Oh, okay. This is a fun game.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, here we go. For without unity, there is no peace, only bitterness and fury, no progress, only exhausting outrage, no nation, only a state of chaos.
Because it's so well worded, it's probably the 19th century.
yeah. They went on 19th century, vocabulary. We don't talk in such highfalutin language today. Are we right?
No, it's Joe Biden 2020.
Joe Biden said that. Oh my goodness.
Okay.
Well, he was from the 19th century. So.
You could definitely argue that. Okay, here's another one.
Okay.
Democracy requires a basic sense of solidarity. We rise or fall as one. There is only the United States of America.
That sounds more
modern.
like a 21st century thing.
Yeah, 21st century.
Barack Obama, 2008.
Okay.
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 The American political system has been totally corrupted. The foundations of American democracy are undermined. This is not democracy. This is oligarchy. Washington works only for the wealthy.
Ooh. That
sounds
very
21st
modern.
century to me.
Yeah. That's going to be our good friend Bernie Sanders in 2016. So the short answer to your question, I'll give you a quote from Joseph Smith. The short answer to your question is yes. There's a lot of
Lots of
familiarity.
parallels.
Generally speaking, people usually make the parallels of the 1850s more, which led up to the Civil War, right? The problem with that is that we're talking about two different sections of the country that could lead to, kind of an all-out civil war. Here we're talking about people all mixed together, right, who are so politically polarized, with the added dimension of it being online as well, where it's kind of a different kind of civil war that's going on, that's kind of ripping apart the country. And in Joseph Smith and his views on the powers and policies of the government of the United States. Now, notice that these words are 19th century, right? And so they sound 19th century, which is difficult sometimes to kind of
like Joe Biden.
Yeah, kind of exactly. Kind of difficult to understand. But this is right early in the idea of his pamphlet. And it says this: unity is power. And when I reflect on the importance of it to the stability of all governments, I am astounded at the silly moves of persons and parties to foment discord in order to ride into power on the current of popular excitement. Nor am I less surprised at the stretches of power or restrictions of right, which too often appear as acts of legislators to pave the way for some favorite political scheme. You could say that in the upcoming election, couldn't you?
You could say that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the answer is yes, there's definitely parallels. And there's been that in different time periods of the United States, right? The early 1800s with Jefferson and Adams. I mean, they're at each other's throats, obviously right before the Civil War, and the late 60s and today, right? Although with the modern technology and algorithms pushing polarization, I don't think we've seen quite the amount that we've seen, at least since the 60s, I would argue, since the 1850s.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So, Derek, what's your main takeaway from all this? What do you hope modern readers take away from the story of Joseph Smith's presidential campaign or the electioneers or anything related to it?
So my biggest takeaway, Joseph Smith in February, they just had printed the views document, right? And they had it read aloud at this meeting. And Joseph Smith says, and the thing that B.H. Roberts talked about, obviously this wasn't serious, where he says, I wouldn't have run if we didn't get treated the way we were treated. And I care more for my job as Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion than I ever would for the President of the United States. But then he goes on to talk about the Constitution and the fact that it's not being enforced. And he says, I am willing to offer my life on the altar of sacrifice, if necessary, for the general good of mankind. And he backed those words up, not only with his death, because, obviously, going into a political situation in the place that they are and expanding it by running for president was a dangerous idea. But he felt strongly enough that somebody needed to do something. And he believed in Section 98 and 101, that the Latter-day Saints were supposed to uphold the Constitution, to try and get good men and wise men into government positions. And so it seems pretty natural to them at this point to do that, but he's willing to sacrifice. these political missionaries that go out. This is the most difficult mission probably of all time, right? As far as in this dispensation where you're going out into a hostile political environment to preach that not only is the restored church of Jesus Christ upon the earth, and there's new scripture, but our president's also running for president of the church, or president of the country. And I want to put another emphasis that Joseph was serious about the pluralization idea, the idea that this was not just about him. So in May of 1844, there's what's known as the Philadelphia Bible riots. And this is an anti-Catholic riot about what Bibles should be in the schools that leads to churches being burned down and people being killed on both sides. Joseph Smith has Willard Richards write a letter to the main alderman of Philadelphia, who was the center of this controversy, who was a Catholic, that basically says, join with us. It's you and us that keep getting persecuted. Join with us in this campaign and we'll protect your rights just like we want our rights protected as well. So there's actual literal outreach too to another persecuted religious group. And so my big takeaway from this is that we got to do something. In fact, I believe we have a covenant responsibility from Section 98 and 101 to do something. Instead of complaining about polarization or throwing our hands up in disgust, look what Joseph was willing to do. Look what these men and women were willing to do to get involved. And this is something that the presidents of the church have talked about in recent years, to get involved, to be bridge builders, to be peacemakers. The last 4 talks by the president of the church, 2 from President Nelson and 2 from President Oaks, have all had the same theme: peacemaking, bridge building.
Mm-hmm.
And you may remember that last year, a gay married man who was part of the new atheist movement was invited to come speak at BYU.
Oh, yeah.
His name was Jonathan Rauch. Mm-hmm. And he came to support his book called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. He said, I was all for everything we were doing in the early 2000s with the new atheist movement. And then I realized, I'm paraphrasing, then I realized, like, without some kind of moral thing that we all agree on, it's chaos. And it was supposed to be Christianity, he says, but Christianity for him, because Christianity on the left of the political spectrum is disappearing at a crazy rate, right? Not just in the United States, but around the world. Whereas Christianity on the right has become, since the 1980s, more and more politically entwined with the Republican Party. And so he says, I found the salvation for America. It's you, pointing to the students, right? The Church of Jesus Christ, Latter-day Saints, he says, has the theological basis for creating the nation the way we need it, based on morality, but based on living in a plural society, working to come to compromise, doing things in a peace-like way, as well as the moral foundation of everything that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does. And that's in his book, which is, by the way, a New York Times bestseller. And so it's not just the prophets of the church that see the unique position that both Latter-day Saint theology and our ability to organize, right? And prophets are just do it, get involved in some way, but do it the right way, as the presidents of the church have said. They've been an inspiration to me as I've studied them, these men and one woman who went on these missions, because they were willing to step out into a very contentious world and try and build peace, try and build a government that would support and help everyone. And I want to do that. I want all of us to do that. I think that's kind of part of what it means to prepare the world for the return of Jesus Christ. So I'm grateful for that. I found out my 3rd great grandfather was actually called doing the research, which was kind of cool that it's in my family history. He went to Boston, was part of Salem, preaching and electioneering in Salem. So I want to be like that. I want others who read this book or choose not to. That's fine. But I want you to follow up with what modern prophets have taught as well, what Joseph Smith did by example, and these missionaries, which is to get involved in the process, make the United States or Australia or Zimbabwe or wherever you are a better government that protects more people because of your involvement.
I love that.
Definitely a good message. And I think one that the leaders of the church are urging right now is that we need to get involved. They're not telling us how to vote, but telling us to be informed, telling us to be engaged, and telling us to get in the fight.
Yeah.
Do what we can to try and fix what we see as wrong with the country, whichever country we live in right now.
Wow. What a fun interview. Derek Sainsbury. Appreciate you coming on our show today and sharing your unique insights through your great study. Appreciate that. And we encourage everybody out there to go pick up a copy of Storming the Nation, The Unknown Contributions of Joseph Smith's Political Missionaries. You can buy it or you can get it for free. Your choice.
Sorry, Derek.
If I was going to try and make money writing books, it would have to be about the second coming or other topics.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I just want your research to get into people's hands. So that's why I said that.
100%.
Anyway,
that's what we're all about here. So
yeah. Absolutely. I know that.
Well, thank you, Derek.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Scott. And we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the church and politics.